Good morning. This is the
Good
Blaine's World
morning.
podcast that can be heard each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also listen in on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can get more information and listen to previous shows on our website, www.blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, in my Zoom studio here in lovely Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information with people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce the amazing Deborah Silverstein, who's a playwright, among other things. And Deborah, you can feel free to wave to all your fans and friends who might be watching this. So that is Deborah. And Deborah is relatively new to the Asheville area. She moved here in 2021 from Boston, Massachusetts. And there she worked, raised a family, and had a 50-year run as a performing singer-songwriter and recording artist. She arrived in North Carolina with a full-length musical, which she'd been working on for 5 years. By virtue of good friends, good fortune, and persistence, she's overjoyed that Asheville's Magnetic Theater Company chose her musical, Riveted, to be part of their new play production program. I think I mentioned to you off the air, Deborah, that's when I decided I had to get you as a guest on this podcast, because I don't mean to keep repeating myself, but that show blew me away. I loved it. My wife did too. And I got to believe other people told you they had a similar reaction from other people.
I had a lot of really strong positive reaction. Yeah,
I mean, and the thing that so amazed me about that show is that I've seen a lot of readings. This was technically a reading,
it
but
was
it
a
was
reading.
as well done a reading as I've ever seen. It felt like you were seeing the show. And before we get into that show, because I could just talk for our whole podcast on Riveted, talk to me a little bit about your background. You told me off the air, you grew up in, I guess, but you grew up in Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
I grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania,
Okay.
which is in western Pennsylvania in the Allegheny Mountains, a northern part of the Appalachian Range. And Johnstown's a small steel mill coal mining town about 75 miles east of Pittsburgh up in the mountains.
And when you were growing up in Johnstown, did you always know you wanted to be into music?
Well, I always sang. I mean, I had a pretty voice, and I loved to sing. And I have a brother who's 7 years older than me, so he brought home a Joan Baez album when I was in the sixth grade, and I spent the rest of my childhood in the basement listening to her record and other records on my hi-fi, and kind of dreaming, maybe I could be a folk singer someday.
Well, it's funny because I grew up in that era too, or I love the music too. My brother, same thing too. He's 4 years older, and he introduced me to Joan Baez, Judy Collins, Leonard Cohen, all the stuff I grew up on. So I grew up on that era. It's a shame you don't have those great folk singers, that used to be. But that was your kind of music. You were
Oh,
a
I
folk
love
singer,
that music. Yes.
and so you were a folk singer. Did you take lessons, or how do you learn to become a
I
performer?
am really pretty untrained for the most part. I was a piano lesson dropout and got a guitar when I was a young teenager and just taught myself how to play. So I've taken some lessons over the years, but I barely, I'm not a trained musician. I barely read music. Um, I learn by ear.
And when you were learning too, there was a time actually before YouTube, people
Oh
actually,
yeah,
can you
right.
imagine? So now it's incredible. People can, I guess, learn a lot of the stuff watching YouTube, but you didn't have that. So you just kind of picked it up yourself. Do you remember in terms of singing? So you were a solo performer, or how was your performing background?
Well, when I first started out, I graduated from college from University of Michigan in 1970, and I lived there for a few more years after that. And so I first started at, there was it still exists, I think, a coffee house called the Ark, and I would, you know, kind of got my nerve together and started going to the, open night sings. And and so for a long time, basically, though, while I was still in Ann Arbor, I just played on my own a little bit, not a lot. And when I moved to Boston, that's when I first started playing with my whole musical life opened up after
You
that.
remember your first paid gig?
Oh, my first paid gig. Well, probably I don't think I got paid the whole time I was, when I was in Ann Arbor. I think I got started getting paid after I moved to Boston.
Because I'm looking in the background, I don't see the first check you ever got or the first $10 bill. I thought it'd be
Oh,
framed somewhere. So,
no.
so you went to college, you started performing though seriously, I guess, when you got to the Boston area?
Yes. I you want me to tell you that story?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it, please.
Okay. So I moved to Boston in the fall of 1973, and I'd written a few songs at that point and was totally interested in finding the music scene, the acoustic music folk scene in Boston, which of course wasn't going to be hard to find. It was everywhere. And I also happened to stumble across an announcement about, I'll try to make this short, about a course that was being offered through a graduate program, an extension of Goddard College in Vermont, and it was based in Cambridge. It was called Cambridge Goddard, and they were offering all these basically kind of radical left wing, mostly political courses, and but master's degrees. But one of them was the role of women in a feminist approach to the role of women in traditional American folk music, which just was like, oh my, that's
Wow.
right up
Yeah.
my alley. And I found these people, and I started participating in this group that was officially a course. There was one enrolled student and the teacher, and then three others of us who started just being participants and hanging around and attending the whole process. And within weeks, we all were singers and we all played instruments and we formed a band. So within a couple months of moving to Boston, I had a string band, a women's string band, and we called ourselves New Harmony Sisterhood. And we met through the course of while the official course was in action, we were meeting at the Rounder Records house. Do you remember
No,
Rounder Records?
don't know that. Yeah.
Okay, so I won't go into that, but anyway, as soon as we formed, we started playing for people's college classrooms and movement gigs and organizing rallies, and we just immediately became part of the progressive radical movement scene in the Boston area.
Do you have any of those records still around?
Oh yeah, we made one record that is called "And Ain't I a Woman," that was produced by Paradon Records. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So Paradon Records was a small company being run by Barbara Dane and Erwin Silber. Barbara Dane was a white blues singer, very politically conscious white blues singer, who by then was sort of at the end of her singing career, but they had a small record company. They produced our record, "And Ain't I a Woman," and eventually their company got folded into Folkways, the Folkways company, and then eventually Folkways became part of the whole Folkways collection, ended up in the Smithsonian American Folklife collection. So our record is part of the American Folklife collection at the Smithsonian.
Very cool. Is the record on your website, by the way?
The record is honestly, I can't remember.
Okay,
if the
but
whole
think about it.
record is-
I'd love to, boy, that'd be a great thing. Or put it on the website. I'd love to hear it, at some point in
Well, you
time.
can get the record,
Right.
actually. The record is available through the Smithsonian. You can get a CD of the record.
No, but I'm saying, but easier if it was on your website or YouTube or something like that, or
Right. There are definitely songs I don't know if the whole thing is on my
okay,
webpage,
great.
but there are definitely songs from it that are on
By the
available.
way, I'll ask you to give a shout out. I don't know if the person's still around, but you mentioned this came out as a result of a course, or you went with these other women to this course. Do you remember the person's name?
Oh, of course. In fact, I'm still in touch with her. The woman who was teaching the course
Please.
is Lanny Legera. She's still alive. She lives in Connecticut. And the other women in the group were Katie Tolles, Marcia Deal, Kendall Hale, who actually lives here in the Asheville area. In fact, in Fairview, Kendall was the fiddler and a singer, and Pat Willette was the bass player, and me. So, and then eventually it was just the five of us. Lanny didn't continue, but we played together for 6 years and traveled all over the place and sang at the first women's music festivals in the Midwest. And we became part, we were part of the whole beginnings of the women's music movement.
Well, do me a favor. So thank you for sharing that. And please send the clip to them as well, saying that we were talking about them. That's very nice that you still, talk about them. We'll give them a shout out that they were still remembered all these years.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very cool. Thank you. So talk a little bit about then. So you were in Boston area. You're doing this for 6 years or so. Where did your musical career take you from there?
Well, after that, I have a cough, so I'm just chomping on lozenges here. After New Harmony broke up, I for a while I got drawn into the Boston bluegrass scene. Sorry. And started playing with some local, really excellent bluegrass musicians. And we formed a band that we called Fire on the Mountain, which is an old traditional bluegrass song. And we played together for a couple years. Steve Watt, Eric Levinson, Paul Silvius, they were my buddies. And so we played together for a while, and eventually, people went their separate ways. And then I decided to forge my own path. And can you pause for a second?
Sure. Take your time. Give me a second. I'm just going to pause for a second. So we're talking with Deborah Silverstein, and I think I have the pronunciation right. Last name Silverstein?
Yes.
Okay, great. And Deborah is this singer-songwriter, and we're just going through some of your background, which is kind of blowing me away here. So right now we're still talking about your performing days, and we got left off. I think we were talking about you're in Boston performing, and then eventually bluegrass. What happened from there to kind of where we are now?
So I did my kind of real bluegrass phase for a couple of years. And then I'm sorry, I'm coughing. I feel like I'm gonna cough again.
No problem. So Deborah, you were telling me about kind of the next stage of your music career. And so after the bluegrass phase, where'd you go from there?
I decided to focus on my solo work and my own music. And I eventually pulled a band together, many of whom were the people I'd been playing the straight bluegrass stuff with. So I had accumulated enough material to record an album, and Howie Tarnower, a local bluegrass musician who I'd been playing with on and off, was the producer, and Eric Levinson was the bass player, and Paul Silvius was the banjo player. Paul eventually went on and played with Del McCrory for a while, who was like a super hot bluegrass player. And so we got this record made, and then it got picked up by a record company called Flying Fish. and Flying Fish released that album in 1987, I believe. And I played out with that album quite a bit for a couple years, did a little bit of traveling around with it.
Now,
Sang
this
at some
album,
folk festivals.
the music was all stuff you had written also?
All my own original stuff. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. How long have you been writing stuff?
Well, I wrote my first song, I think probably in 1971. I remember that exactly, writing my first song.
Okay. And did you record that somewhere?
It's been recorded. A subsequent band, yes, recorded
Because,
that song.
because I'm thinking out loud, next time I have you on a show, we'll get you to do that first, we'll get you to do that first song.
I can do that. Yeah,
but-
that was yeah.
Well-
It's interesting because I thought I wrote it at the time. I thought it was kind of a silly little song. It eventually, like, it's sort of one of the most meaningful things I've ever written, frankly.
Songwriters amaze me in the sense that, so you're writing the song, did you write also the, were you writing both the lyrics and the music to it as well?
Yeah, yeah. Everybody has their own style. I mean, I tend to begin with a phrase. Some lyrical phrase catches my attention, and I typically begin attaching some melody to that phrase, and then it starts building that way. I never write a whole set of lyrics and then figure out a melody for it, and I never write a melody and then figure out lyrics for it. I write it together.
When you write a song, do you ever go back 10 years later, 20 years later, want to change it or revise it, or does that ever
yeah.
happen?
Yeah, that happens.
And so over the years, ballpark, I'll put you on the spot, how many songs have you written? Any idea?
Well, I think I've probably written a couple hundred songs altogether. Not
Okay.
all of them I remember. I mean, some of them were lost to me, but probably a couple hundred.
And you're still writing songs?
Well, I wrote all the songs for Riveted.
Well, since that's a good segue to talk a little bit about Riveted. And one of the reasons I asked you to come on board, because as I told you off the air, that I had the pleasure of seeing, I guess, a staged reading of it. And talk a little bit, some music. Was this the first musical you ever did?
Yes, it's the first musical I've ever written. I want to just mention historically that
Okay.
after my solo work, then I formed a 4-woman a cappella quartet, and we sang together for about 6 years, and we made 2 CDs. We were called Taproot, and Gail Runlet, Ann Goodwin, Rebecca Brown, and me.
It's amazing you remember all these names. I'm impressed.
I
So
couldn't
so
forget these people.
you do this a cappella work, but now let's get into coming to Asheville. And I should ask you, by the way, the question everybody always wants to know: what brought you to Asheville?
Well, the short answer is that I have an adult daughter living here, and I have my other daughter is living in Chapel Hill, and my husband's son, my stepson, lives in Charlottesville, Virginia. So all 3 of our kids ended up in the South, and we decided to make the trip ourselves. I've had a fascination for Asheville for 40 years, ever since I read Look Homeward Angel. I just connected to that book, and I connected to Asheville because I grew up in a small town in the mountains in the Appalachians. So it's why my younger daughter went to school here, and she went to school here because in looking through the college books, this big volume of college, I didn't know there was a college here. I didn't know UNCA had a branch here, and so we saw that there's a small liberal arts college, a branch of the UNCA system in Asheville. So both of my daughters, because I said, well, apply to that school too, and they did, and my younger one ended up coming to school here, and then she met a guy and they got married, and he'd been here, gone to school here too. They left for a while, but then they came back and they've settled here. And so they're here. And then my older daughter ended up in at UNC in Chapel Hill. And as I said, my stepson's in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I thought, we're moving, and we did.
So when you came to this area, though, now let's talk back to the musical. You already had developed this musical, Riveted. How long? Talk about that process in terms of when you started it and how long it took.
So Riveted evolved out of a song, and the song happened because one of the women that I had been in my original band with 50 years ago, New Harmony Sisterhood, Marcia, her name is Marcia Deal. We were still friends. She lived in, everyone else had moved away. Marcia and I were the only ones left in the Boston area. And Marcia did a lot of, she was an archivist in her own way and collected historical material and music. And she'd gotten herself a gig singing at a big radical women's history conference at Boston University, and asked me to sing music with her. So we were going to be singing movement songs from the 70s, women's movement songs. And in the week leading up to that event, not with any intention, I ended up writing a song that I called Riveted that thematically was about the women of that World War II generation, which is my mother's generation, and what became of them, which is the whole feminine mystique story. That the women were recruited to work in the factories because the men all went to war, and then as soon as the war ended, the women were shoved out of their jobs to make room for the men coming home from the war, and they all went off to shuttled off into the suburbs to live their suburban lives of the 50s and have their families. And I was one of the children of that generation, that like as you were yourself. And I've thought about what my mother's plight in that situation, and what a kind of sucky generation that was to be an educated woman, middle-class white woman. And my thoughts about that evolved into this song, which I wrote called Riveted. And I sang it at that conference, and people responded to it. And after I wrote the song, I started thinking about, I love theater. I go to plays all the time. And I started thinking about the play that was embedded inside the story, the lyrics of this song. And for a long time, I thought, okay, this could be a musical. I will write the music, and I need to find a playwright to write the play. And for a few years, I bounced this idea around in my mind, and I talked to different people about it, and I talked to different writers. And one day I had a long conversation with a friend of mine who was both a musician and a writer, and thought maybe she'd be interested in working on the play. And we spent an afternoon talking about our mothers. She's a little bit younger than me, but of Armenian extraction, and just our mother's generation, and how its impact on us as their daughters, all those issues. And at the end of that that afternoon, she said, and I had the beginnings of my idea for the play, how I wanted the story to work. She said, "It's a great idea. I have my own things to work on. You have to write this yourself." And at first I thought, well, bummer, that's a bummer. Like, she's not going to do it either. And it just, like, that just set me off in a new direction. I thought, well, okay, I'm going to write it myself. And first I made a connection with a man who I knew, had known for many, many years, who was a writer and had done some playwriting. and he mentored me a bit. And basically, you know, first he said, write an outline. I wrote an outline. He said, okay, that works. That's good. And I said, well, okay, now what? He said, well, now write the play. And I did. I just made a decision to, you know, I carved out time and I worked at it and I wrote the play.
How long did it take you to write?
It took me about a year, you know, because I wasn't doing it full time. I was working and had my family, etc. I'd say it probably took about a year to write a full script, and and songs. And at that point, by that time, I had. I mean, now there are about 17 songs in it, and then by then there were probably 12. And so I had a staged reading in Boston, a live staged reading, under the umbrella of a wonderful group in the Boston area called Playwrights Platform. And that was wonderful, a wonderful experience. Very, very, very raw relative to the reading that Magnetic did. And the play was way too long at that point. It was over 2 hours long. And after that, I worked with a young woman who was just finishing the BU graduate program in playwriting and dramaturgy. And she was my dramaturge, and I sort of revised the play under her support, and was going to have a second staged reading, which was now maybe a year and a half or 2 years after, maybe a year and a half after the first one. I was going to do it at Club Passim, which is a Boston area coffee house that I sung at many times, and a very venerable institution. And that's when COVID broke out. And so we couldn't do it live at Passim. We actually did do it on Zoom, and that was the early days of Zoom. And we still can't do music on Zoom anyway, but it was, you know, very rough. And then that was it. Then the whole world shut down. So at some point, maybe 6 months or 8 months after that, I was part of I joined a few different you know, musical theater forums online, and one of them was advertising. You know, here we have all these very, very talented people, theater people, out of work, you know, use them. And there was a list of names, and one name on the list was a woman in the New York area who was specifically musical theater dramaturge and guide. And I contacted her, and she took me on, and I worked with her for about 6 months, meeting periodically, and revised it enormously with her help, and wrote a bunch more songs. And that's essentially what I had at the point that I moved to Asheville. I had the piece that I had worked on with her guidance.
So how were we lucky then to have you come to Asheville, but then to find Magnetic Theater, or Magnetic Theater find you? How'd that work out?
Well, it's a very sweet story. It has a couple chapters to it. The very first chapter was my husband and I. We had bought the house that we're living in about a year before we moved here, because we knew we wanted to move, but we weren't ready to move yet. We found a house, we bought the house, we had tenants living in it. And then we moved in, and it's in 5 Points, which on Hillside, near the Reed Creek Greenway. We moved at the beginning of February of 2021, I guess, I think, yeah. And so I knew I knew my daughter and you know, her husband and one other person in the area. And it was still COVID time, like everything was still pretty much shut down. But I think in March, we went out one day to walk on the Greenway, and this play was happening.
I know.
You remember that?
I didn't see you there, but I know
you
it.
went to that play.
Wasn't that fun? Right.
And we had no idea what it was. It was just like, wow, this is so cool. I mean, it's so Asheville. And the person who was sitting at the ticket desk, just on the street, was tipping.
Right.
And I just walked up to her and started talking to her, and she explained what the play was and this and that, and we bought a ticket and we did the play. And I mean, I've learned over the years. I was a very shy person when I was young, and I've gotten over most of that at this point in my life. And I've also learned that you just have to put your stuff out there if you hope something to make something happen. And I was hoping I could make something happen with my play. So I told her, oh, I wrote a play, blah, 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 and when I got back from going to the play, the walking play, I told her the story and she was interested. And then I sang her the song Riveted, and she was interested. And she said, yeah, send it to me, because at that point she was the person in charge of receiving new material. So I did. And she said, I mean, she did get back to me and said they were interested, but sort of it kind of wasn't happening.
Right.
And then through another woman who I had met here via other connections, friend in Boston and her friend in California introduced me to a woman here in Asheville, Sarah Rubin, who's a fiddler. And Sarah and I had gotten to know each other a bit, and she was enthusiastic about the play. And she said, I know somebody who's involved in theater locally, John Crutchfield. Do you know
Oh,
his
sure. I know John very well.
name?
Amazing guy. I've been to his plays, and he's been a guest on my show as well. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So I went to his recent one
Right.
man
Me
play,
too.
which I thought was fantastic.
I didn't see you there either.
Right. So she contacted him, and I sent him the play, and he liked it, and we got together and met at for drinks one afternoon. And he said, okay, I'm gonna contact a couple people, and one of them was Katie Jones.
Okay, sure.
And so at this point, Katie knew about Riveted from Tippin, but I don't
Tippin.
think Katie had read it. And because John contacted her, she read it, and she got back in touch with me and said, we want to do it.
And the rest was history. And talk about how it was done then, which is really cool. So it wasn't produced, but it was part of their, I guess, new play series.
Well, they have a new play
Right.
program, and there's a play that's going to be produced in the spring that is this year's new play production. And mine is next year's.
Wait, is that the one they're doing now, Happy Land?
No.
Oh, that's another one.
It's a theme about teachers.
Okay.
I can't remember the title. I'm sorry.
Okay. But anyway, so your play then, very exciting, was chosen for the following year. It'll be produced by Magnetic.
Yes. So the plan is to do a reading this year, which has happened now, and then a full production probably in April of 2024.
And for the benefit of the folks who weren't at the reading, I'd like to just talk about two things. One, in terms of what was the idea of the reading? That it's unlike most readings I've been to. No, this was a full-blown acted production, some really fine actors, some really fine musicians. And so that's what they did. They actually kind of mini, I guess, production of it, but people were there saw the show itself, a version of it.
Well, I mean, every reading is the whole play.
Right.
Magnetic hasn't typically done musicals, although
Right.
their current play, Happy Land, is also a musical. But because we were going to do the staged reading, it had to be sung as well as read. And so there had to be some musicians to accompany the singing. I found the two musicians who are who played for the reading, Rob Sine, and Tiara Ratti, who was a neighbor of mine. Rob is a friend of my son-in-law. My son-in-law, local son-in-law, is a musician, and Rob is a great local musician and fronts a bunch of different bands. And so my son-in-law Peter introduced me to Rob, and I asked Rob if he would be willing to play guitar, and he was. And then Tiara is a high school student, but a fiddle prodigy, and she just lives up the street from me, and I had met her, so I asked her if she wanted to play on it. And then the music all was in very, very just basic melody line scores. And as I said, I'm not a trained musician, so I can't score things. I've always had to have somebody write out a score for me. But there was no sophisticated arrangement of any sort. And I'm a folk musician. I'm not a musical theater type musician, period. And just by unbelievable good fortune, Katie was looking for somebody who could play the piano for the auditions, and somebody gave her the name of Steve Sensenig, who has had a whole
I was going to say, right.
a whole career in musical theater, but has just moved back to this area, which is where he's from originally, and was looking for new things to do. So Steve shows up for the just to play piano for the audition. Is like, he can do everything.
Right.
So he became the official musical director, and he's going to do a lot more work. I mean, they were trying to keep it more folky, and I this isn't a folk themed musical. And so, there are some folk themed musicals that need to stay true to that genre, but I'm not wedded to the music being, super folky. And so I think it's going to evolve quite a bit.
And Deborah, let me ask you, put you on the spot a little bit, in terms of if you can give the Reader's Digest version of the show, what will people see?
Okay.
And it has to be right. I'll give you about 45 minutes to give. No,
for you. That's what I need. Okay, I've said it a million times, and every time it's different. It's a family drama. It focuses on three primary female characters: an elderly woman who is called Rosie, her 60-something daughter, who I call Betty, and Betty's 30-something daughter, Emma. And Betty is my generation. Just because of the timing, she's a little bit younger than me. But in order for Rosie to be alive and sentient, Rosie has to be a certain age. So it's built around the notion that Rosie has been living in her 1950s little suburban house, and her husband has been dead for quite some time, and she needs to move into senior care housing. And Betty has come in from Philadelphia, Rosie's daughter, and Emma, the granddaughter, has come in from Brooklyn for the weekend, and they're going to go through the stuff in the house. And they discover boxes hidden away in the attic. And in the course of unearthing the artifacts in these boxes, all these hidden stories of Rosie's life begin to emerge. And in the course of telling these stories, the rifts and trauma that beset this family through the 60s and 70s, and the culture wars and social, political wars that tore through our country, the Vietnam era, and tore through this family and wreaked havoc in this family. The embedded secrets and stories emerge, and they primarily emerge in flashback scenes. So there are about 6 flashback scenes that span from the World War II era up through the Vietnam era, that tell the story of the events that beset this family, and rifts that occurred, and relationships that were damaged, and lives that were hurt, ruined. And over the course of the play, there's some healing and resolution occurs amongst these three characters, primarily between Rosie and Betty.
And even as you're telling it, I'm getting a chill just hearing the story again. It was such a moving story, but also you got a break, and I don't know who was responsible for it, but it seemed like it was almost perfectly cast. I'm seeing the three people in front of me, their performances, and I guess Magnetic took care of that, or Katie or Aaron McCarson was the director. Who chose?
Yes,
Aaron
McCarson was the director of this show, of this reading, and Katie Jones is the co-artistic director of the theater, and so they were the principal people involved in orchestrating this. And
who chose the actors? Who chose the actors?
Well, we did a casting call.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, and people came and auditioned.
Yeah. Were you involved in that also?
I was present at that. Yes.
Must have been very exciting just to see it, unfold.
The whole thing has been just absolutely thrilling beyond belief. I mean, it is literally my dream come true. That this could happen is my dream come true.
We're so excited for that. And talk about then what's going to happen. So we did the stage reading, and then I believe you said it's on schedule for the spring of next year.
The plan is in April of 2024, there will be a full production. So there'll be, for this event, there was a fiddle, piano, and guitar, but there'll be a larger ensemble, backup ensemble, and it'll be a staged production, and the whole 9 yards.
Because even with the three musical performers, I thought were just perfect. It's just that they were so. I mean, it won't happen, but I almost wish you could have all the people who were involved in this last one to audition, come out. Because I don't know how you felt, but I just thought everyone just about perfect.
I was just moved and thrilled. I mean, I got goosebumps myself just sitting and listening to it.
You should be. Yeah. And so moving forward, so what happens? Are we still going to do some revisions on the play over the next year?
Yes. The next stage is that I will work with Katie and probably Aaron and Steve on doing some revisions to the script, and maybe, I doubt that I will write any more music, but we'll sort of orchestrate the songs.
I hope you don't, because I just, like I said, love the music as it is. I wish I could hear it again. And after this show gets produced, in your spare time, Deborah, are you working on any other musical things or songs, or what else?
That's the $1 million question.
Oh, you can't tell us. No.
Oh no, I am actually. I have an idea that I've had for quite a while. And I do understand. I mean, this is my first rodeo in the theater world, and it's very different than doing my own music. And in that, I wrote all of this, but I'm not I'm not performing it. And so, I mean, there'll be creative work involved in doing this next set of preparations for the actual production, but most of my creative work is done. And so I do understand that if I want to continue to be creatively employed for my own sake, I have to do something different. And I do have an idea that I'm very excited about, and I'm beginning to work toward that idea.
Well, just ask you as a favor, keep me in mind, or when you're ready to do another show, we'll have you talk about this next idea when you're ready for it.
Oh, absolutely.
And also, I'll put you on the spot. We'll also have you maybe recreate that very first song you ever sang, and we'll have a
Oh,
musical interlude to it too, so you can pass it on to your
I would be
future
happy to do that.
generations.
Certainly not tonight because I can barely talk tonight, but
Well, you did great. Anyway, I'd like to just wrap up with Deborah, just having you repeat information. If folks want to know more about you or get in touch with you, what's the best bet?
you can reach me through my website. My website is www.debobiz, DEBOBIZ, like Deborah, DEBOBIZ.com.
Okay, and that's all, has all the contact information?
Yes,
Okay,
you can get to me through that. I can also, I mean, I'll say my email address
sure.
is debobiz, the same word, DEBOBIZ at comcast.net.
Okay. I'd like to thank you for being my guest on this
I
podcast.
have a Facebook
Oh, okay.
music page too. So I have a page, Deborah Silverstein Music is my music Facebook page.
Okay. And again, I'd like to thank Deborah Silverstein for being my guest on this Blaine's World podcast. I'd also like to remind folks that Blaine's World can be seen on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Spotify. You can listen to us, Apple Podcasts, blainesworld.net, our website. And again, Deborah, thank you. And also thanks to Cappy Tassetti, my producer. I look forward to, especially you, Deborah, seeing you many times in the future in the Asheville area. You're a gift to us. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.